Before I get into the game, I just want to read the script I'm writing to whoever will listen to it. So I really hope that you watch this. This is the second script out of two so far. It's not a different variation, it's just the second one. As the 19th century came to a close, so did the coffin of the democratic dream of the United States. In 1866, the once united nation had collapsed into several regional nations. Shortly after, as did their rival, the Confederate States of America, in its own Civil War. The nations birthed from their death would go on to survive the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1898, the nations of New England, the Midwest Union, formerly the Great Lake Union, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, and the Kingdom of Italy all signed the Munich Charter, which formed the Quantus Alliance, also referred to as the Five-Nation Alliance. As the era of progressivism washed over the former United States, it failed to take a foothold in both the federal states and the Confederate States of America. Both nations were relics from a bygone era. Both were remnants of what was, which refused to adapt. Both would regret this. The Confederacy, struggling to compete with the northern or western nations' vast industry, would ramp up their cotton production and exportation in February of 1894. However, as the cotton trade began to die and eventually collapsed altogether in 1898, the nation was truly at a loss. They had no idea what to do and especially how to recover after their economy failed in 1897. Due to a run on banks over the cotton trade collapse. This event, later known as the July Cotton Run, began the 6-year period where the Confederacy had to pull itself out of the hole it dug for itself. Unbeknownst to them, their next move would be their worst yet. As their northern and western neighbors had vast industries, they believed that they could make up for their shortfalling by forcing their slaves that had originally worked in cotton fields into factories. The African Americans forced to work would be in horrible conditions. Many wouldn't see the outside world again, and most factories where slaves were used would be where they stayed their entire lives. The conditions of these factories were so atrocious that a former white factory worker, John Red Pines, would publish Uncle Lee's Floor, which documented what conditions were like in these factories. Though Pines was a socialist and tried to spread his views through this, and all that came was a lynch mob on August 9th, 1898. His book, however, would make it out and give Europe of the Confederacy. Along with his book, the writings of Karl Marx would spread the ideology of socialism throughout the South. The Confederacy would also heavily rely on trade with the European powers of Britain and France, forming strong ties between the three. They would, however, not invest in their navy enough, leading to the military branch relying on outdated ironclads in some future engagements. The nation of New England, after seeing the three-term presidency of Teddy Roosevelt from his 1906, 1910, and 1914 elections, would see him put an emphasis on the German alliance. He would attempt a rapprochement between New England and the United Kingdom, but the nation had become enemies with the island nation. There would be Midwestern investments on New England trade and naval advancements. These increased investments of the New England Navy would see the formation of the Roosevelt class, favoring speed over power. These advancements led to an increased emphasis on the naval arms race in Britain, which had already been in full swing ever since the German Empire had begun its naval expansion. The German Empire, formed from remnants of the German Confederation after the Franco-Prussian War, would be a natural ally of the German-descendant North American nations. In its peace treaty with France, it had granted them less of an occupation and less reparations in exchange for French Guiana. This gave them This gave them a new need for a strong navy as well as new colonial responsibilities. France, even with this watered-down agreement, had grown contempt for their believed enemy. France would engage with the Germans again. During their colonial venture, they would see that the British had no love for them. For the efforts of Joseph Chamberlain, messages were muddled due to his directness in politics. These failed diplomatic gestures would lead to the Entente Cordiale, which was the cooling of relations between the age-old rivals of France and Britain. Even before the formation of the German Empire in Europe and the Great American Divide in North America, the European continent would see a great war known as the Crimean War. This war saw the Russian Empire face the British, French, and Ottomans across the Baltic Sea, Balkans, and the Crimean Peninsula. This saw early Russian advancements and victories, however saw the weakness of the Russians as British, Ottomans, and French forces held their ground and advanced. Allied blunders saw headlines such as the Charge of the Light Brigade. These headlines echoed just how little countries' populations actually wished to go to war. Generals on both sides were still not fully aware of changing times, heavily relying on tactics from the Napoleonic Wars. Nonetheless, Allied forces of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire saw victory in 1856 after years of fighting. In the Treaty of Paris of 1856, the British Empire secured the Russian colony of Russian America, also known as Alaska. After this peace treaty, the later Second Russian invasion saw the Ottomans and French. The colony, formerly known as British North America, now called Canada, stretched from sea to shining sea, without any obscurities, just as the United States once had. British holdings now were fully connected from Australia to Canada and South Africa to India. As the United States crashed and burned to their north, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador would fear the wrath of the European powers. They were especially afraid that Britain, France, or Spain would try to bring them back under European rule. However, after the Confederate States purchased Cuba and eventually the Bahamas from European powers, the South American countries' new fear was a homegrown one. They feared that the Confederates would attempt to establish their dream of the Golden Circle, unbeknownst to nations around the Americas and abroad. These dreams were now unfeasible, as a huge amount of land had broken away as the Republic of Texas, which caused the idea to crumble. Parts of the plan would continue, but only minor Caribbean holdings would be annexed. The idea of annexing or puppeting nations surrounding them now was nigh impossible. In 1879, the nations of Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia would meet in La Venta, Colombia, where they'd sign the La Venta Accords. These accords would form a federal council uniting the three nations, but not uniting their governments entirely. Though the nations were united, the governing style was very much formatted like the Articles of Confederation that the United States originally used as a uniting document, meaning that the government put an emphasis on state government. This echoed the failed dream of Simeon Bolivar with his idea of Gran Colombia. This became a larger echo as the country was named the Confederation of Gran Colombia. In addition, the country had originally faltered and collapsed as the nation fractured after constant political infighting for centralism versus federation. However, named after a failed idea or not, its plans similar to Gran Colombia, that being the ability to stand up to European powers, would bring the nations closer. Peru would be invited as well as Bolivia, but Peru would see the country as a sort of rival. The countries would never come to blows, but relations would stay tense at best. For Bolivia, joining heavily relied on if Peru had. Even as they'd lost their coastline to both Peru and Chile the year the CGC was founded, they would still be isolated from the rest of the CGC if Peru hadn't agreed to join. Even though Bolivia didn't join, they would form a close ally of the Confederation as a defense against both Peru and the newly formed American Union of Spaniards. Due to the rebirth of Gran Colombia as the Confederation of Gran Colombia, Chile, after fighting both Bolivia and Peru, would seek an ally on the continent. Ralph. They would find an ally in Argentina. These countries would see that Bolivia and the Confederation of Gran Colombia were very close allies. Chile, previously at war with Bolivia and Argentina, worried of encirclement if Brazil became an ally to the CGC, would seek to unite. On August 12, 1882, the nations of Chile and Argentina would unite into the American Union of Spaniards. Quickly, the Union offered Peru a place in the Union. They almost accepted, however, realizing that if a conflict broke out between them and the CGC or Bolivia, their lands would become a war zone where most of the fighting would occur. Instead, Peru became similar to Bolivia in that they become somewhat proxy states, eventually seeing small internal conflicts supported by one another. As the British established more colonies in Africa during the Berlin Conference attended by most colonial nations, including non-colonial nations like the Pacific States, Midwest Union, New England, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the Confederation of Gran Colombia. The American nations, most notably New England, Mexico, the Midwest Union, Republic of Texas, and CGC, would attempt to limit European expansion into Africa any further. The Pacific States, on the other hand, attempted to negotiate for Pacific territories in exchange for their support for European claims. Other American nations and many citizens criticized the nation's actions, leading to the Republic of Texas spreading propaganda depicting the Pacific States senators shaking hands with the devil, leading to the press using it for the headline, "The nation's leaders dancing with the devil." Mexico's involvement went nearly unnoticed, as they made no claims nor had a large say in the limitations of European expansion. They were, however, backed by several other American nations. Otto von Bismarck even supported limitations as he didn't want to take part in colonialism. This led to a political season of mockery, where he was called an American patriot by Reichstag members. Germany would come away from the Berlin Conference with 4 different colonies, respectively. Though the German Kaiser wanted more, these, these colonies were acquired with the idea of future expansion, be it through war, diplomacy, or purchase. Though only fully uniting the peninsula in 1871, the relatively young Kingdom of Italy was a great power in development. Its formation compared to the younger German Empire, which was calculated and pragmatic, and the formation of Italy was like that of a child jumping at an opportunity, being ready or not. However, the kingdom would score a huge win as they joined in the Austro-Prussian War on Prussia's side, where they would be granted Veneta, Venetia. I don't know. Of course, only after it had been given to France, as Austria felt that Italy hadn't earned it. The kingdom would then score another victory, as the French-backed Papal States would be left undefended or supported, as France would be too occupied in the Franco-Prussian War, leading to the Papal States' annexation as the Kingdom of Italy marched their army into the streets of Rome. The entrenched power. German relations would be strong as Italy and Germany saw themselves as the underdogs due to the entrenched powers of Britain and France being mostly against them. Due to their strong ties, Germany would invite Italy to the Berlin Conference, where a total of 20 nations attended the conference, from the Pacific States of America to the Russian Empire. The Italian representative at the Berlin Conference, Edora, Ed, I don't know. I hope I'm saying this right. Edorado. Edorado. I know. Edorado. I don't know. De Launi. A name. Negotiated for Liberia. Not Liberia. Libya, Somalia, and Eritrea. Though Italy wished for a larger presence in the Horn of Africa, their Eritrea and Somalia colonies provided a way for future expansion. However, the surprising and equally humiliating loss of Ethiopia in the Italo-Ethiopian War made the kingdom a laughingstock. Even their ally of the German Empire had mocked them in private. Italy, for their loss, would begin to look inwards, and begin to develop a strong navy to enforce their will in the Mediterranean, seeing it as their birthright. In secret, even from their ally of Germany, Italy wished to live the glory days of the Roman Empire. Though it looked impossible, the kingdom would form an alliance later in the latter half of the 20th century that appeared to be the Roman Empire. However, this eventual alliance would be a shadow of what Rome was. Though the British were once their biggest historical enemy, the victory of the German Empire in the Franco-Prussian War formed a hatred in France for Germany. France had not only lost land in Europe and its last stake in the New World, but they had lost their spirit. A French soldier, veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, Charles Denis Sutter Bourbaki, I don't know, it's a French name, would write shortly before his death in the War of Greek Independence. Though we survived, it wasn't living. It was as if the nation itself had lost. We lost land, we'd been occupied, we had to pay them to leave, practically. Our leader, Napoleon III, looked just as our country did, disheveled and broken. Eventually, after the war, he left. I, to this day, hate him for dragging us into that war, but that does not excuse those dirty Germans. Germany had become France's biggest enemy and replaced the British, who France had seemingly always been at odds with. Even the King of Italy, a nation France had been helping unite a historical ally against the Austrian. And a historical ally against the Austrians appeared to turn against them as they annexed the French-backed Papal States. Franco-Italian Franco-Italian relations would stay tense until the Berlin Conference, where the historical enemies of France and Britain worked together to make sure that the upstart Germans and Italians didn't acquire too many valuable colonies. Back over in the New World, the politics after the Berlin Conference were a mess. In the Pacific states of America, the Democrats, the biggest and most successful party of the nation, would wane. Support for the Redwood Party would begin to skyrocket, not seen since the losses in the Second Plains War ended in another victory for the Midwest Union and the Pacific States of America. It exposed the rot in its military structure and wouldn't be removed so easily. As the Mexican Revolution opened up in mid-19... Okay, before I go on, I need to go get water. My throat is dry. the one who made gas hurt. I'm the gas prices. No, I'm not. Because if I was gas prices, I would make more gas. I really hope I heated up enough. But anyway, time to get back to reading. Where was I? Alright. The Democratic President... Oh wait, now I'm going to read the whole sentence again. As the Mexican Revolution opened up in mid-1907, Democratic President Henry Lennington stationed troops on the Mexican border to dissuade Mexican raids. However, the raid on San Diego led to a large amount of Pacific PSA casualties. This raid and accompanying losses would be blamed on Lennington, and he would lose re-election to the Redwood Party member Sanford Adams, who would work with Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz to depose Francisco I Maduro. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I really apologize if I am. Or I'm not, whatever. Same thing. Anyways, I'm sorry. They would install Bernardo Reyes as president with Felix Diaz as his VP in 1911 after nearly 5 years of fighting and support against Francisco. Before the Pacific States' involvement in the Mexican Revolution in 1906, the nations of New England, the Midwest Union, and the Pacific States would meet in Sacramento to sign the Sacramento Charter, setting into existence the North American Defense Organization. This new entity would be a secret organization that brought the militaries of the three nations where they'd work closely together. After the Pacific States of America, the PSA's involvement in the Mexican Revolution with some support via supplies and funds from their eastern allies, they would begin to strong-arm Mexico and offer them a place in NATO. Though Mexico would reject it for the time being, later after the First Great War, Mexico, along with the new North American nations, would join. I'm going to eat some soup. I got beef stew. In South America, as the Berlin Conference concluded and European ambassadors gained large swaths of land in Africa, some members on the Confederation of Gran Colombia's Federal Council would begin to argue that their ambassador, Raymond Santo Domingo Villa, I apologize if I butcher any of these names, had not pushed hard enough to limit European expansion. They would eventually remove him as their ambassador with Jose Marcelino Hurtado in 1886. The nation, weirdly enough, became good allies with the German Empire, originally fearing expansion by the British, Dutch, and French. After the Franco-Prussian War, the German Empire would annex French Guiana, now freeing German power after the Berlin Conference. The two would form an unlikely alliance. It wouldn't be until 1904 that the two nations would set aside their biases and form an alliance, though not outright join Germany and their allies in the First Great War. They would supply their side heavily with oil and certain food products. They'd also begin to increase their naval budget, which allowed them to form a good foothold in the Caribbean. This naval buildup, known as the 1904 One Caribbean buildup caused deep resentment in the CSA, who only then began to build up their navy. Though they constructed newer designs, their navy still resembled one of the 1860s or the 1880s due to their reluctance to they requested British assistance to construct better ships. The British would refuse unless the Confederates abolished slavery. The Confederates, still relying heavily on slavery to fuel their economy, would refuse and instead would build up their navy with numbers. In comparison, the Grand Colombian Navy would be constructed of more modern ships, with help from New England and the German Empire. New England, the one American nation that had up to that point been able to compete with the British Royal Navy after the fall of the United States, would ally themselves with the other American powers, and was the biggest force behind the formation of the NADO. The signing of the Sacramento Charters. Oh, and the same thing. Oh my god. I'm gonna eat some more beef stew before I get to this. Okay. Compared to their northern neighbor of the CGC, the American Union Spaniards would form an equally unlikely alliance with the Russian Empire. This alliance, formed as German immigrants moving through the nation, led to a scare, allowing for other nationalities to rise. After the Crimean War, Britain, as a spoil of war, would annex the Russian colony, known as Russian America, now the Dominion of Alaska. As Canadians moved into the territory and Anglified it, Russians either fled across the Bering Strait or to other nations. This led to a large minority of Russians in Hawaii, the northern PSA, and South America. These new Russo-Latin Americans would begin to hold a large sway in the government. This allowed for the government to pass the Anti-German Act, which prevented German descendants from running for office. The nation had effectively become ruled by foreigners. The Latin American nations began to look increasingly like their northern neighbors in Central America and Mexico. They'd become unstable, and especially in the heavily mountainous and forested areas, rebels and insurgent groups would operate. In the Midwest Union, the White-Tailed Party, a branch of the old Northern Democratic Party, which, like their West Coast counterparts, distanced themselves from their Southern counterparts as best they could, going as far as to rename and rebrand. Once the Democratic donkey, they'd take the image of the White-Tailed Deer Party. Well, after the Great American Division, they wouldn't win over their rival, the Homeland Party, until 1896. The political climate after the Chicago Charter was signed was chaotic. Parties would form quickly, but due to distrust of the Democrats due to their Southern relation, the Republicans were losing the war. A party known as the Lake Party saw only one presidency before the Homeland Party formed a strong backing. The Homeland Party, a remnant of Lincoln's Republican Party, ruled until 1894, only having lost the first election due to a lack of confidence. However, after establishing a foothold, and especially after the First Plains War, they'd gain a large foothold in the states gained in the war. The Whitetails would have a short period of dominance beginning in 1894, lasting until 1906, with the Homeland Party winning the presidency under William Howard Taft. Taft, a supporter of Teddy Roosevelt, the New England president, would launch a slurry of antitrust acts during his presidency against corporations like the Ohio Interstate Mining Corporation, Midwest Coal and Iron, and the continent-sprawling Standard Oil. Though the OIMC was a threat as well as the Midwest Coal and Iron, Standard was common enemy number one for most of the old America. Besides the Federal States and Confederates, the Republic of Texas, New England, the Midwest Union, and the Pacific States would form an intercontinental council known as the United American Trade Council. Okay, hold on, I'm going to eat more stew. That's a good stew. This council, formed in 1907, would dismantle Standard's reach. The company would eventually fall apart after fighting a year-long losing battle. Standard would, however, stay somewhat unified in both the FSA and CSA, due to their countries being both in the hands of businesses and reluctant to allow for any outside interstate ideas. Eventually, after looking inwards after a Taft victory over Standard in September of 1908, he set his sights on the OIMC, Midwest Iron and Coal, Midwest Railways, and even Erie Fishing. Standard's remnants would eventually merge with these Midwestern companies. Under government supervision, created the Federal Department of Trade and Commerce, which oversaw companies that they believed were pushing the boundaries of a monopoly. More stew, please. Oh, this is the last page and it's not even done. Fantastic. In New England, the very nation that sparked the American wave of progressivism would revel in its victory over Standard Oil. Alongside the Midwest Union, they would argue and support. Eventually, Taft and Roosevelt would split in ideologies, where Taft would still allow businesses to take or buy lands that Roosevelt later said he'd make national parks. Roosevelt tried to argue for more conservation in comparison. I am done reading for now, and I really hope you guys enjoyed that, because I am working very hard on it. And now I'm going to eat more stew.